Hola amigos, hola amigas, qué gusto estar con ustedes para una nueva edición de nuestro programa Conversaciones Americanas. Hoy vamos a tener un especial acompañante, huésped en nuestro programa, que es el embajador Mark Entwistle, que fue embajador de Canadá en Cuba. Para conveniencia de la entrevista la vamos a hacer en inglés, como hemos hecho ya varias, y en el futuro vamos a hacer lo posible para en cuestión de 2 semanas tener la entrevista después que salga en inglés traducida al español para que ustedes la puedan ver. Pero no podíamos dejar de escapar la oportunidad, dada la relevancia de las relaciones cubano-canadienses, y el embajador Entwistle aceptó, después de que muchas veces nosotros habíamos hablado de hacer una entrevista, hacerla, así que la vamos a hacer hoy. So, Mark, I just introduced you in Spanish. I know that you understand what I said and how honored we are that you accepted to be in our program. And we will basically launch the interview in English, and eventually I will try to translate the interview in Spanish for our largest audience in Spanish. Mark, I remember the first time I saw you. You were ambassador in Cuba, and I was a student at the Cuban Diplomatic Academy, at the Higher Institute of International Relations. You came to the Institute and you make a presentation, a short course. I think it was like 3 or 4 lectures only about communication and politics. And I have never forgotten the message that you repeat in every conference, every lectures, and you say, stay on message and stay out of trouble. You said that there were 2 things. I don't know if you remember that, but you said that there were 2 things that we need to learn. And the first one was stay on message, and the second was stay out of trouble. So I'm happy that you are here with me. And I'm sure that you will be on message, and I'm sure that you and I will stay out of trouble in this conversation. Okay. So let me mention that you were the press secretary for the press director for Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and then you have a career in the foreign service. You went to work in Cuba at a very important moment in the relations between Cuba and Canada. And later you have been a consultant, and you have been involved in connecting Canadian private sector with Cuba, also humanitarian organizations. And we have been together in panels in the United States, I think in Canada too. So I am very happy and honored that you are here with us. So Mark, I would like to begin by some reference to your career. With which experience did you go to Cuba when you went to work as ambassador in Havana?
Wow, Arturo, muchas gracias y agradezco la oportunidad de hablar en inglés. De verdad, simplemente yo puedo expresarme más claramente. Entonces, muchas gracias a ti. Y es buenísimo verte otra vez después de demasiado tiempo. Yes, when I went to Cuba, in terms of my experience, I had no experience in Cuba or about Cuban affairs at all. And the way our foreign service works, this is very common. I went straight from the office of the Prime Minister. I was assigned to that position, and I left. I had never been to Cuba. I, of course, as a generally informed person, I knew enough about Cuba or some things about Cuba. I was trained academically at the university in history. So, I had some basic, understandings and about fundamentals of Cuban history, but I arrived completely, not with no previous experience. Let's put it that way. So I learned, Arturo, everything on the ground in real time. And of course, one of the very first things I learned in Cuba when I arrived, in fact, in the summer of 1993, the special period, el periodo especial, was in full force. It was obviously, quite surprising, but the first thing I learned was that Cuba is a complicated place. It's very nuanced. There often things are not exactly as they seem at all times. There are many different dynamics going on. It's a fascinating country with a deep, intriguing history, but very complex. And I think that people who look at Cuba from the outside and try to um, describe it or caricature it as by simple narratives miss the reality of Cuba. And in fact, my experience was that it's a kaleidoscope of different realities all existing simultaneously, and it really depends on which Cuba you're talking about, which Cubans you're talking to at any particular time in their history, as the history of the country has evolved and moved and ebbed and flowed. So, I remember, the very first expressions that Cubans would say to me, "Pero, señor embajador, es muy complicado." And from then on, I understood more and more and more.
So, Mark, you arrived to Cuba at a very important moment. It was, in terms of the history of international relations, the beginning of the post-Cold War era. And for a country like Cuba that was so connected to the communist bloc, the relationship with Canada, a capitalist country with which Cuba has developed very strong ties in terms of tourism, trade, and from then on, investment. I remember even that by the I would say late 80s, if I don't remember wrong, that there were a relative of mine, someone that was married to one of my aunt, and he was very proud when he talked to other people that he still have some Canadian insurance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he said he will say, so I have access to things here, but I also he will say things that he has Canadian insurance. How did you see the particular juncture in which you arrived to Cuba by the early 1990s, the world that was leaving and the new world arriving, and the anchor for Cuba that was, in some sense, an special relations with Canada since the time of Diefenbaker?
Yes, absolutely, Arturo. You're right. It was a particularly historic time in many ways, because when the Soviet Union had collapsed, as your listeners will know, to your point, Cuba's GDP had collapsed. The United States still had not established, its diplomatic relations. It was still running a diplomatic operation in Havana, but it was an interest section, the special interest section under the auspices of the Embassy of Switzerland. So the Americans were there, but they weren't there in a formal way. Cuba was, for the first time, I would argue, really alone in many ways in the world. Um, uh, uh, the relationship with Canada became important, particularly important to the Cuban government at the time. Canada was one, as people will know, one of really only two countries that never broke their diplomatic relations through all that period, Canada and Mexico. Two countries that are now still partners in our relationship with the United States. In the context of the North American Free Trade, the USMCA, et cetera, which is coming up for renegotiation. So we have a lot of contact with the Mexicans still on those issues. But Canada had a quite specific place in history and a role. We had been there for a long time, and one of the things that people sometimes forget is that the relationship between Canada and Cuba goes back 125 years. Canadian banks established very early in Cuba. The Bank of Nova Scotia established a branch in Havana in 1902 before it even opened a branch in a bank in Montreal. The Royal Bank of Canada was there. I believe it had dozens of branches across Cuba. Canadian banks, along with a couple of Americans, financed large parts of the Cuban sugar trade. To your point, the Canadian insurance industry was very powerful in Cuba at the time, and many of those companies still, in an interesting little twist, several of them still maintain formally a technical office in Cuba because it's still a remnant of those past times. The Cuban fishing fleet, when it was operational, fished off the Grand Banks and came into Halifax Harbor and into Newfoundland. We had the nuns and priests would come from Quebec and were very common in Cuba, especially in the office of the cardinal in Havana. So there are all these constant ties. So we had a kind of a deep history of engagement. Canada had been in Cuba since the probably early 1940s. So we had been there all along. We were there through the revolutionary period, both the revolution itself, the run up to it, the 1950s, the Batista coup, all the post-revolutionary period, and all the constant change of the revolutionary period. Canada's always been there. And at the time, in the absence of many other countries that are now quite present, and in the absence of the United Nations system, which is now present in Cuba, Canada had a role to play, and we were in a way like kind of big fish in a smaller pond. We had tremendous access to the Cuban government. I did, which was very interesting for a Canadian diplomat, because in other countries around the world, especially when the Americans are present, we are a smaller player, obviously. At that time in Cuba, in those circumstances, Canada, I think, took on a role and an importance greater than was normal. I was able to see senior members of the Cuban leadership often. I spent I must have met Fidel Castro dozens of times, probably 3 dozen times. I spent hours, 100 hours probably, with Fidel Castro in conversation, much of it private. And Arturo, you'll appreciate this. The office of the president would phone me up at midnight, wake me up. The phone would ring, and el señor embajador es el despacho del presidente de la República. They didn't call him el comandante or Fidel with me. He was the presidente de la República. The president would like to see you. Can you come to the office? And so, yeah, okay, I'll do that, of course. And so I'd go through the darkened streets of Havana, pitch black at night, off to the Palacio Presidencial, and there was Fidel Castro, and he'd spend hours and hours and hours in conversation. So this was very unique situation and quite rare. But I did have the opportunity to gain insights and understandings in some ways in how the senior political leadership of Cuba was thinking about things. Um, there were times when it was a bit surreal. I have to pinch myself. Arguably, sometimes I had better access than other leaders of the revolution. He'd come by the house, by the residence, and come and knock on the door, and come in for a drink.
I
It was
heard,
it
I
was
heard,
crazy, Arturo. It was kind of crazy, to be honest. But at the same time, and I'm sorry I interrupted you. At the same time, um, it did just allow the two countries in some ways to have a level of conversation that was more informal and less protocol driven than might have been the case.
well, I two things I want to say that from very early on, Fidel Castro, when he went to in April '59 to the United States, there is a moment that he crossed to Canada and then come back to the United
Yes,
States. Canada
yes,
is a very important piece in the project of post 1959 foreign policy. And honestly, when I have read more, it seems that previous governments, like the Auténtico governments in the 1940s, also
yes,
look at Canada with some interest. And I found that Rafael Montoro, one of the autonomies that eventually become a Cuban ambassador after 1902, he looked a lot when he was on the autonomist idea. He looked a lot to the model of Canada and Britain as trying to have something with Spain of this kind. So Canada
yes,
has been not only in practice, but in the ideas and in the projection of Cuban foreign policy in a very important way. I also heard that during your time there, Carlos Laje in particular and other leaders that were involved in redesigning the insertion of Cuba in a world economy in which the communist bloc was not existing. Also, he was in permanent contact with you. In fact, when I mentioned the possibility of interviewing you some time ago, at that time you told me that you were quite busy. People told me, I remember that he used to have a very direct connection with Carlos Laje, who was at that time the most important leader in charge of the economic reform of the 1990s that were very, very important to say. If you want to talk about this issue a little more, I will be very happy to hear you. And the other thing that I want to mention is that I received the benefit of the relationship with Canada in two important ways. As a Jew, there was a very strong ties with the Canadian Jewish Congress that
yes,
support the Passover products for the Jewish community, and people will come. And there was a very institutionalized connection. And also, I imagine that given the relevance of the church at a moment in which Cuba was opening and dropping a lot of the atheism in the official policy, something that people that don't know Cuba don't mention that, but this was a very important process of detotalitariization. There was a lot of totalitarian policies in the area of religion, and by the 1990s, most of these policies were withdrawn, and you were in a very important position, not only because you were a Canadian ambassador, it's because Archbishop Cardinal Ortega
correct.
was, in some sense, a fellow Canadian. I,
Yes,
I, I met him. He will talk frequently about his time of studying in Montreal and the experience in Quebec. And it's something that I would like to talk with you. You know, I know that there might be some information that you want to keep for yourself, or like most diplomats, to stay out of trouble, to quote you again. But anything that you would like to share with the audience about your time and your contacts with Cardinal Ortega, and with the people that were trying to talk about the economic reform in Cuba, it will be welcome.
Well, thank you, Arturo. This is very interesting. You've named several people, and you're absolutely correct. These were relationships that I had at the time, and I spent a lot of time with Carlos Laje Davila. That was a very interesting period because, of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and as Cuba was looking at restructuring its economy, there were several players. Laje played a key role in all of this. We spent a lot of time talking about economic reform issues. You know, and I'll come back to it. We all. Francisco Soberón at the central bank as well was a key thinker on a lot of this. There was a comparative openness to different ways of seeing the economy. We sent a number of experts. We even sent, and the Cuban people will probably hate me for this, but we even sent down teams of experts to talk about a proper income tax system as the Cuban economy started to evolve into a more, let's say, normal looking economy, which was the idea at the time, a social democratic style economy. Cuban economists like Pedro Monreal and others who you will know well were very involved in all of these conversations. It was a heady period in the sense that all possibilities in a way were on the table. In some ways, the conversation about the economy was quite a bit ahead of conversations about the domestic politics. But I spent a lot of time with Laje, who played a critical role in all of this. In terms of the Jewish community, we were very connected to the Cuban Jewish community, very connected, Arturo. When Jose Miller was leading the community, and Adela as well. Yes, and
who recently died, by the way. She recently died, and I remember that she always has very good opinions about the Canadian diplomats, and particularly about you, both of them, Miller and Adela. Remember you with good memories.
Oh, Arturo, thank you for that. That's very meaningful to me. We had a very close relationship. Both personal and also institutional, because one thing that people probably don't know or realize, in the same way that the government of Switzerland held the interest section of the United States, we were actually the interest section for the state of Israel. And the Jewish agency would come and use our offices at the Embassy of Canada in Havana for Cuban Jews wishing to make Aliyah to go to Israel. We were very involved in the community, supporting Cuban Jewry, helping with the rebuilding of the main synagogue. I remember in particular one very moving event that we did at the synagogue itself when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in Israel.
I was there.
You were there. You see how moving people were crying, and this was so important that we were there to support the community.
At that time, I wrote a paper that was read there in honor to Yitzhak Rabin. And not only that, it was not only for Aliyah. Just to get a visa, I went to Israel and back, and I did it through the Canadian embassy, and I remember that for me was very important also because of the Carlton program that
Yes.
I was doing the Carlton program in economics, but I
Yes, you were.
remember this specific moment that you were in the patronato, because that's
Yes.
the synagogue,
Yes.
and you were
Yes.
there. Yeah.
Yes.
Um,
Oh, yes. I remember it. Well, you see, we share so many memories. I remember when you were doing the Carleton MA program in economics. I remember very clearly and being there with you. And so many memories from the past. And I will also mention Cardinal Ortega. That was also a very important relationship. Um, Cardinal
can you say a
Ortega,
little more about that? Not only
yes,
that, in what sense was important?
he was he was a number one, a great Cuban patriot. In addition to being a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, he believed in the welfare and the goodness of the Cuban people. His ties to Canada, as you said, were very, very deep. Um, I will say one thing that's not the most politically correct thing, but there were elements in the Cuban American community in Miami who said very bad things about the cardinal at the time, that suggesting that he was an agent of the government and all this kind of crazy talk. This is not true.
Okay.
Cardinal Ortega worked for the good of the Cuban people. He used the Catholic Church to the greatest effect that he could. They rebuilt a relationship with the Cuban state, one built on respect. They spoke out, about human rights issues. They spoke out about the well-being of the people. He did it in a very skillful, elegant way. And the Catholic Church was very important at the time, and it still is, um, because I've always thought it's one of the two national pan-Cuban institutions. And so it has great reach. It has great reach into communities. He set the tone of respect, and most importantly, the need for national reconciliation. I personally believe, Arturo, that given the political situation we're in right now, the big geopolitics of the US-Cuba relationship, um, uh, the only pathway towards a sustainable future for this will be some proper relationship between the two countries, based on respect, but also a commitment to national reconciliation of the various parts of the community, because the community is very multifaceted. There are many different Cubans, but in both Cuba and in the United States. If I had one wish, it would be that the Cuban community large would set aside the memory wars of the past and relitigating every grievance and every horrible thing that's been ever done on both, and the old narratives, the quite lazy, old, stale narratives, that paints one side one way and the other side paints the other people another way, and start to reconnect as Cubans again. I think that unless that happens, we will just repeat ourselves.
Well, I want to tell you that some Cubans might criticize you for
Oh, I know.
helping to organize the income tax. Still, we don't have it. But something that I have the opportunity to talk a lot with Cardinal Ortega is that we typically talk about not to move backward, but to move forward. And the
Yes.
creation of the basis for a welfare state was for us very important. When we talk about human rights, the views of promoting human rights and reconciliation, we could not think about a Cuba in which the inequalities of the past, in which, for instance, there was 31% in 1957 of rural poverty, the
Yes.
extreme poverty, we thought that it's important to move ahead, not relitigating the problem, the conflicts of the past, but he was a very international figure. The opportunity that he had, Colonel Ortega, of going to school in Canada, provide him a different view about the world, in which there were market economies that were not necessarily market societies, in which there was like a cushion with a minimal plateau of equal access to health, education, and these areas, not necessarily under the same basis that the communist system in Cuba has, but he saw that as part of his Christian values, like it's my case. I am honestly, I am in this area of social democratic, Christian democratic values. I think this is where I move. Well, thank you very much for touching these issues. I want to talk now about the experience that we have, because if you were in Cuba at the birth of a new international system, now we are at the birth of a different system, according to many scholars. So I would like to share with you for a moment a piece of a very important speech that your prime minister, your current prime minister, I don't know how close you are to his political position, but the speech of Prime Minister Carney in Davos has been seen in all over the world as a watershed moment in terms of rhetoric, at least. No, that the speech in itself changed the world, but it's basically a recognition that the post-Cold War era is now entering into a post-Cold War era, and there are many things that signals that we cannot neglect.
In French, and then I'll switch back to English. Merci Larry. C'est un plaisir et un devoir d'être parmi vous en ce point tournant pour le Canada et pour le monde. Et je parlerai aujourd'hui de la rupture de l'ordre mondial, de la fin d'une fiction agréable et du début d'une réalité brutale, où la géopolitique des grandes puissances n'est soumise à aucune contrainte. Mais je vous soumets, par ailleurs, que les autres pays, en particulier les puissances moyennes comme le Canada, ne sont pas impuissants. Ils possèdent la capacité de construire une nouvelle ordre qui intègre nos valeurs, comme le respect des droits humains, le développement durable, la solidarité, la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale des États. La puissance des moins puissants commence par l'honnêteté. It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't. So what are our options? In 1978, the Czech dissident Václav Havel, later president, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And in it, he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with the greengrocer. Every morning, the shopkeeper places a sign in his window: "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel called this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down. For decades.
My friend Mark Entwistle, so I am anxious to hear your comment about what the Prime Minister said and how do you see that this new reality that when he talked about it in French, he called it a brutal reality. I noticed that he didn't use the word brutal when he used it in English. And for someone with your experience and your knowledge about the foreign policy of Canada and the relationship with Cuba, I would like to hear about how do you see this brutal reality impacting Canada, and if you can say something about Cuba or the Canadian relationship with Cuba.
Sure, absolutely, Arturo. That speech by the Prime Minister, in my opinion, was, you used the word a watershed moment earlier. I agree with you. I think it was, frankly, one of the most important political speeches given in decades, because it showed the way or sent the signals that there's a way for countries that don't have an abundance of hard military power, the famous middle powers of the world, to pursue a new order in which they can participate and not be held hostage to the vicissitudes of great power politics. This was not a speech I don't think people had expected to hear. I think it took everybody by surprise. It comes from a place, I think, and it's a very honest a portrayal of the world where the post-World War II rules-based global order has been shattered. We are particularly witness to the current government of the United States. President Trump, who is the principal architect, frankly, of the rupture. Supporters and proponents of this worldview will say, well, to use the Prime Minister's analogy, we're just returning to the natural order of things. And I think Prime Minister Carney is saying, no, there doesn't have to be that natural order of things. This has come partly from a very painful realization in Canada that the relationship with the United States that we assumed and thought that we had for generations and grew up with, my generation grew up with an idea that we were friends and allies, and that we shared the continent together. We shared very similar cultures in many ways. And we had, to use the cliche, we had each other's back. There are all kinds of examples where we've risen to the occasion to safeguard and protect Americans. We fought wars side by side with the Americans, and in a matter of months, and I'll speak very frankly and honestly, the President of the United States and those around him shattered that worldview. It was incredibly shocking to Canadians. I think we're now getting more accustomed to it. It's manifested by the punitive use of the tariffs that the Americans are doing, the constant threats, the president's earlier comments about making Canada the 51st state, which implies annexation, all kinds of crazy stuff. If it was, and the reason it resonated with Canadians is he kept repeating it. It wasn't just some joke he made, oh, I'm joking. He kept repeating it, and nobody would correct it. So the conclusion that Canadians reached, including the Prime Minister, and I'm sure this has been in his mind for a long career, was that the United States for Canada is no longer a reliable partner and ally, therefore, and even adversarial to us. Therefore, the world has shifted, like a tectonic plate has shifted. Now, that kind of shock and what shocked Canadians for Cubans over decades, it's kind of business as usual, right?
Yes.
In the sense of, over 60 years of one of the most comprehensive trade and investment embargoes in world economic history. A foreign policy of the United States effectively to create regime change, which remains in place and has been the cornerstone of it all. And to do so, you have to crush the Cuban economy completely. And if one level of effort doesn't work, you just keep turning it up. With the assumption in mind, of course, that you create the conditions that are so horrible that the Cuban state will buckle, and there'll be popular uprisings, and the whole thing will change, and something will happen. In a much lesser degree, in a way, the Americans are treating us in the same way. So for Canadians, this was shocking, completely. So the Prime Minister's speech reflects that. Where I believe, as somebody who practiced diplomacy for decades, for 2 decades, where Canadian and Cuban interests are going to, I think, increasingly intersect, will be in how to manage an American view of the hemisphere of Latin America, which was reflected and embedded in the national security strategy, which the White House issued last November, which you will be well aware of, and your listeners, if they have not read it, I would recommend that they read it. It can be a quite frightening document. It is really that kind of MAGA ideological worldview of great power politics, of transactional foreign policy, in which, of course, the Monroe Doctrine of the early 1820s has been resurrected, polished off and rebranded. But what it says effectively is that the hemisphere, belongs to the United States, and all countries in the hemisphere will be subservient to American interests. That's effectively what it says in quite explicit terms, which includes Canada, it includes Cuba, it includes all of Latin America. By making explicit reference to the Monroe Doctrine, this is a worldview from, as I mentioned, the early 1820s. We're in 2026. This is a 200-year-old idea. The hemisphere has changed in 2 centuries. This is not the same place. And so
we are talking about before Mackenzie King.
Yes, I mean, yes, we're going to have
and before the Civil War, and before the Cuban First War for Independence.
But this is 40 years before the first Cuban War of Independence, when this idea was promoted by the United States as a first gesture of an imperial ambition for certainly for the hemisphere, and to have it now reissued and rebranded, but reissued. I don't think. I personally don't believe that governments and broadly in Latin America have truly processed yet what this will mean in practice. So Canada and Cuba will be amongst now are members, equal members, not of the Summit of the Americas with the United States. They're now members of a group of nations trying to figure out what to do about the implications of the American worldview for the hemisphere. Now, one could argue think that Canada could be more supportive, for example, of Cuba in its current economic distress, a distress which is caused, in equal parts, I would say, in a kind of trifecta of decisions made by the Cuban government itself, economic decisions, the Cuban economy. There's a lot of room for reform of the Cuban economy to make it work better. That's one piece of it. Another piece is the effect of the U.S. embargo. There's a view that you'll see on social media, and Arturo, you will see it all the time, and you'll hear it. You'll even hear it from Secretary Rubio loud and clear, that the U.S. embargo has nothing to do with the distress of Cuba and the humanitarian crisis and the economic disastrous economic situation of Cuba right now. This is not true. It does affect Cuban economic development very, very much. And of course, COVID just added, a very, very an additional little piece to the puzzle from which I don't think the Cuban economy is truly recovered. But I personally don't believe that you're going to see much more active engagement by Canada with Cuba at the present time, even in the context of the humanitarian crisis and even in the context of the national security strategy of the United States, simply because we have a very big issue to fix with the United States coming up, which is the renewal of the free trade agreement. And that's going to be very difficult. It's going to be crazy, a gong show, to use the expression, I predict. But I don't think any government of Canada can afford to not be very careful and very smart-minded in dealing with the Trump administration while it's got that challenge looming. So I think for the time being, I would not expect a particularly active or loud engagement on the part of Canada with Cuba right now, except to do the proper things and say the proper things and maintain the relationship. That's what I think.
Well, I remember that when NAFTA, or there was the Treaty of Free Trade with Canada, one of the reasons that, or one of the main advocates to adding Mexico to the treaty was Prime Minister Mulroney and
Yes.
people from Canada, on the idea that the two other countries in North America could help to balance the power of the United States. In this sense, I just want to suggest the idea that I believe that there is an opportunity also now, because those talks would be or are already talks of the highest level. Things that, as you know, low-level diplomats sometimes get complicated. I'm not sure that President Trump is thinking in terms of a grand strategy in the long term in areas such as energy security, a struggle against or the fight against international crime and things like that, and the role of the Caribbean in a North American community. That, in my view, it's a very important issue that you see, for instance, in Europe, a lot of talk about the Mediterranean basin that you don't see so present in the conversation of the largest free trade area, that is the Canadian, Mexican, American, I don't know how you call it there. Here in Mexico, they call it telecom. In Canada, how do they call it now? Because they don't want to use the word NAFTA.
No.
let's call it the continuation. I don't want to call it NAFTA 2.0 or this one will be NAFTA 3.0, but in some sense you get where I am coming from.
Oh, I do.
But,
I do.
But something important here is the Caribbean Basin area. And in terms of geopolitics, the stability of Cuba. And to be honest, I'm going to go back to a conception that some people criticize, but in my view, it was correct, but it got derailed with the Helms-Burton law. The notion of a peaceful, I'm going to highlight it, peaceful democratic transition in Cuba. And
Yes.
this is in the interest of the whole Caribbean, Central America and Caribbean region. And of course, see it coldly. If you see coldly in a cold way, you
Yes.
will notice that it's a major interest of the North American community. And Canada has important interest, historical connection with the Caribbean, etc. And I believe that there is an opportunity, at least, that Canadians and Mexicans have a conversation with their high-level counterparts in the United States. Unfortunately, I don't think that Rubio is in the right. He is not in the car for the right. But in abstract, this is a very important issue. Here, I also would like to point out that the signal has been negative in the case of Cuba, and I would like to conclude asking you about how do you see the situation, particularly of Cuba and the Canadian, with your Canadian eyes that you already has mentioned. But I believe that in the context of the policy of the oil blockade, we are seeing kind of two speeches or two discourses even coming from Washington. Secretary Rubio is claiming that there is no oil blockade. According to him, since he is very involved in the notion of denying the Cuban denunciation of the economic war, he declared outside the G7 summit that there is no oil blockade. And just 2 days later, Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary of the White House, was asked about an interest by President Sheinbaum to sell another oil ship to Cuba, and her answer was that the policy of confiscating ships in violation of the policy of denying access to oil to Cuba is still the policy of the White House. That these include exemptions that the White House can decide unilaterally whether to let you send the ship, enter the ship or not, but that the policy of the oil blockade is still in place. So I know that this is a very peculiar administration. So the signal to Canada and to Mexico and to Russia and to anyone are confused, but it's even more confused when you see or we normalize the situation in which the press secretary of the White House says something and the Secretary of State say the opposite. And at least I believe that partners, friends of the United States, could basically at some point say, why don't you clarify which is your policy, or you want to live in this kind of perpetual ambiguity that can cause confusion in the way we interact with the island.
Yes, I agree, Arturo. And the bottom line is that I believe there is a great deal of confusion about what the objectives of the United States are vis-a-vis Cuba, because they shift all the time. And they've moved from, you might recall, right after the operation to remove President Maduro from Venezuela,
Yeah.
they moved from a kind of excited, giddy, regime change language around the total collapse of Cuba. That of course didn't happen, and it's now moved into talk about some kind of a deal. And the deal, what it looks like from my position, just with no real line of sight, is it looks like some talks. There is engagement, talks underway, that at a level that one would expect between the two countries. These are, in other words, the same kind of talks and negotiations that have taken place over the decades multiple times between the two countries. But that deal, at least as it seems to be somehow in play, this is not a regime change deal. So there's a disconnect, there. It's very hard to understand what the U.S. objectives are vis-a-vis Cuba. My argument that, in fact, the United States and Canada probably share a single objective for Cuba completely, and that is that a stable, more prosperous Cuba is in the best interest of the hemisphere, of both our countries, certainly of the United States. If for nothing else, on migration issues alone. And to your point about the broader Caribbean, nothing attracts the attention of American politicians, and especially in the current Trump 2 administration, than migration issues. But you need to have a Cuba that people will stay in, right? And to do that, I mean, let's really, really get down to the reality of the real, as we would say in English, the brass tacks of this. To prevent Cubans trying to go to the United States and the immigration issues that the Trump administration wants to stop, and the president himself has said things that I'm sure would not be well received even in Cuban Miami, but where he speaks his mind on some of these issues, it kind of comes out of his head, where he wants to see a prosperous Cuba, not for regional stability, but so that Cuban Americans can go back. That's literally what he says. And so if that's driving that part of the conversation, I don't think that's where Secretary Rubio is, on his side of the conversation. But a stable, more prosperous Cuba is in everybody's best interest. I personally believe that Cuba has the capacity to evolve to a different place. We already saw the germs of it. It's already evolved in multiple ways that people outside the island don't see. I believe that with generational change, that there is every plausibility that it can evolve to a different place. The kind of place that people were talking about in the first half of the 1990s, when I was there, was a place that looked like a market economy, but with strong state participation in strategic industries and sectors, and utilities. It would look a lot like Canada. It could look like, or a lot like Scandinavia over time. I'm not saying now. The other piece of the puzzle where the real rubber hits the road, I'm using all these English, idiomatic expressions, where the real brass tacks, the U.S. embargo to really create a prosperous Cuba has to be taken down. Because when Secretary Rubio says, we want you, Cuba, to make all these economic reforms and become prosperous, oh, by the way, we're going to strangle and throttle you with our embargo, it's an internal contradiction that makes it impossible, even if one was to think that the Cuban political leadership would be open to doing all of this. It can't, because of the embargo, because American companies can't participate. in the way that it's perceived, I think, by the Secretary of the White House. So there are deep internal contradictions in the U.S. approach to Cuba, very ahistorical, fundamental lack of understanding of the history of Cuba. Some of the stuff the president says, Arturo, ridicule the basic tenets of Cuban nationalism and identity that are going back 150 years. You know, when he says, I can do anything I want with Cuba, I can take it, I can do anything I want with it. I think in Cuban Miami, if people aren't quite offended by this, they should be offended by it, because that's like 1868 on, right? This is the whole thing. This is what it's all about. Sovereign and an independent.
It's the equivalent of calling Canada the 51st state of the United States.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. We're getting it. What Cuba's lived through for years, we're now getting it. It's the same kind of thing. I think the ingredients are there for an understanding between the two countries if there was enough vision to see it.
I think I know that we are finishing. I think that there is a possibility, as some people has mentioned, of a Nixon going to China opportunity with Trump, but people that say that, in my view, are ignoring. I have lived now in America for 25 years.
Yes.
And I believe that people that said that are forgetting who is the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. It's not Henry Kissinger, it's Marco Rubio. So for a very important piece on the Nixon going to China moment was that Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State, and he has a view well expressed of a realist perspective that saw this move as important. And the other thing that I would like to highlight, based on what you talk about migration, is that there is a relationship between the migration issue and the diagnostics, the diagnostic about Cuban society. The only way you can justify the level of harassment, bullying against Cuba is you have to claim, as Rubio claimed, that Cuba is a kind of Hitler's Germany in the Caribbean.
Right.
This is obviously wrong, but
it's
only with this perspective you can justify the level of aggression against Cuba that is taking place. And the question is, if Cuba is a gigantic concentration camp, why the doors are not open for everyone escaping from there? I honestly believe that the only politician in the United States that can hold this line of bullying and having a policy toward a so-called Hitler Germany in the Caribbean and deny refugee status to people escaping from them is Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. I don't think that there is other politician in America that can do that, but he still can do it. And
yes,
we are gonna see a lot of this in the next month. God willing, we don't see a military action. But I believe that countries in the neighbor, good neighbors of the United States and Cuba, like Canada, have a special responsibility. Honestly, I believe that you are right saying that we should not expect a major move in this area because of the priority of the free trade negotiations. But I'm afraid that if we don't do something important in the next month, we are going to regret it. Give me a more optimistic note if you want to have it, if you want to bring it. But I want to give you the opportunity to say the last word. And I must tell you, Mark, that I am extremely grateful for this opportunity and the great insight that you share with me and the people that follow this program.
Well, thank you, Arturo, very, very much. It was a great pleasure. It's so good to see you again. We shared many experiences in the past, and it's always wonderful to see you, and I appreciate that. Maybe if I could just leave one last thought, and it's that as American political leaders work through in the coming month various options, none of which are good vis-a-vis Cuba, I would hope, not that they would ever listen to us, but I would hope that they recognize that history hangs over Cuba like a fog. And while the economic situation now is dire and bad, if they mismanage themselves, they will start a new cycle of a rebellious Cuban nationalism, which will produce another Fidel Castro 10 to 20 years from now. And just to close with a great line that I remember from
Before you close, because now it came to me something that I want to ask you. Is there anything that you believe the Cuban government can do to improve the situation, its position versus the current situation?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, in the sense that people quite generally, or in a kind of cavalier, say, well, make economic reforms. Yeah, okay. But what? I mean, they have to find ways to allow Cubans to create income for themselves and buying power, because that'll help fuel, an economic recovery, which means jobs. So short of freeing up the Cuban private sector even more than it is now, potentially, they can't really open up foreign investment, because foreign investors can do almost anything they want. They can hold 100% ownership of companies. So it's all kind of there. Myself personally, probably have to do things that will reestablish some greater level of confidence in the part of the Cuban people in the competence of their management and their participation in their own society, more than economic reform. Because I think really economic reform is so linked to the embargo, partly. It really is. But so that Cubans can once again, so just free up the expression, free up start preparatory work for a more open political environment in Cuba, so that, because they may find that not everybody wants to overthrow them, as people think. They want to participate in decision making in the future of their country. So I think that would be the one particular thing that I wish they would do very much.
I believe that decentralization is a good way to begin.
Absolutely.
And look at more competitive elections, for instance, at the city level.
Yes.
In my view, will be proper. But you know what? I have been saying that for a while. And to tell you the truth, not even within the academic community, within the Cuban American community, there is a lot of people that criticize the Cuban government for being maximalist, but they are maximalist themselves of all or nothing. And in some sense, it reminds me another good ambassador, that was Ambassador Bonsal, that was the first ambassador after the revolution, who claimed that the United States did this favor to the Cuban opposition by becoming its captain.
Mhm.
It's my
Mhm.
my view on that. But you were coming with a nice quote that I was anxious to listen when I
No,
interrupted you.
and just before I go, the maximalist positions is part of the problem, 100%. It goes back to my reconciliation piece, which I do think
Yeah.
is the key to everything. And because everybody is trapped in these constant memory wars
Yeah.
and the battle of narratives. Stop with all of this stuff. Just, this was like decades ago. And let's look to the future, to quote Cardinal Ortega. Anyway, I just wanted to end because there's a beautiful a line from a song. I believe, remember Carlos Puebla, the
Yes.
singer, the trova singer? And it goes something like, los caminos de mi Cuba nunca van donde deben, a donde deben. And I think that go right from when we started out. My first thing I learned about Cuba was how complicated it was. Those roads in Cuba, and this is what the government of the United States needs to understand, including the secretary, because when you bite into that Cuban apple, you're not totally sure what you're getting into, because los caminos nunca
Van donde,
van a donde deben. Sí.
van donde, bueno, so Mark, it has been a great pleasure. We hope that this one is the first one, but not the last appearance of you in our program. What a great pleasure.
Well, likewise, Arturo, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. You take care.
Hasta la vista. Ha sido una conversación con el ex embajador de Canadá en Cuba, Mark Entwistle. Este es Conversaciones Americanas. Hasta la próxima. Chao.